Well, thank you, first of all, to ASU for the very kind invitation to be part of this conference and for allowing me to address a very, very important topic, which is inclusion and diversity in higher education and in our institutions. I want to address this through two separate strands, two separate areas. The first is trends in social fracture over the last few years and why the issue particularly of socio-economic and economic stagnation and inequality is urgent and important and something that we have to tackle. And the second part of my intervention will be how should higher education institutions address this issue. But let me focus first. Let me try to draw a diagnosis on the challenge that we face. And in fact, I think that this is one of the greatest challenges that we face. It's a long-term trend of economic erosion of our middle classes. This is a product of a number of factors and drivers, but there is one that I think is particularly significant, which is the impact of technological innovation and technological transformation on our productive processes and its impact on how income is generated and distributed within our societies. This is operated through a major shift in the jobs market, in the employment distribution. And the more we study this, the more we learn about how, to a large extent, emerging technologies collide head-on with the current tasks and functions being performed by humans in the labor market. I think this field began producing insights, this field of work, a long time ago, but the most relevant work specifically about automation, robotization, or computerization, as it was called, is really not that old. So some of the more relevant studies are, say, 20, 25 years old, and they have been showing consistently that in fact these technologies are going to do away, if not with entire job categories, we know that they're going to do away with a lot of the functions that are currently being performed by humans in the labor market. We also know that this plays out, this puts in motion two effects. One is a depression on salaries in some of these sectors and in some of these job categories where that automation is taking place. And ultimately can lead to redundancies and job destruction. But it's the first effect that is perhaps the one that takes place or that occurs sooner and that has a very immediate effect on the well-being of people under employment. Now, this process of transformation of the jobs market that we're seeing, particularly services sector jobs, is not unique or unprecedented. We've seen changes to our labor market in the past that were very aggressive, radical, and to some extent very rapid. So, for example, in the US, just to give you an example, between about 1850 and 1970, so in the space of about 120 years, the percentage of the US active labor force employed in agriculture, in the primary sector, collapsed from, say, I think it was close to 70% to under 5%. So the primary sector ceased to be a major generator of employment in the US over that period. Something similar is happening and has been happening in the secondary sector, in the industrial sector, since the 70s and 80s. We have seen almost a halving of the total number of jobs in industry over that 30-year period. In both of these instances, by the way, we saw increases in productivity. So through the deployment of these technologies, productivity increased, the total number of jobs in that sector collapsed. This is beginning to happen in the services sector, so this is new. It seems to be happening very rapidly. So we're faced with a major challenge, which is trying to move away our employment distribution from the areas of the distribution that are exposed to these processes of automation. Say, for example, in the transportation sector, we know that the deployment of self-driving cars and trucks, self-driving vehicles, will have a huge impact in employment across advanced economies. So in the US, for example, if I could show you a map of the US with, on every state, the name of the most common job, truck driver will pop up in around half of the US states at the moment. And we know that if we get the insurance and the technological and another number of pieces right, the incentive to deploy self-driving trucks and taxis and vehicles will be very, very high and will probably happen fairly quickly. So, we have this driver, which is a transformation in the job space. And this is producing very clearly in the aggregate problems in the income distribution space. So just to give you an example, over the last 30 years in the US, 70% of households saw no real market income increase. There's been a slight pickup in the past year or so, but it's only the beginning of a change of trend, and it doesn't compensate for what has been a very protracted period over a number of decades of income stagnation of the American middle class. This is particularly surprising because over that 35-year period, US GDP grew by 14-fold. So you have huge growth in the aggregate, but you have a very unequal distribution of the growth of income within the US. What this tells you is that a very small number of people is capturing that income growth. And in fact, that is the case. And if I could show you the percentage of income growth accruing to the top 0.01% of income earners in the US, you would see that over the past 30 years, there's been a massive concentration of income growth in the highest income percentile, so in the more prosperous Americans in terms of income. Now, why is this relevant, this issue of both stagnation and inequality? How does this affect our politics and our lives? And if I could summarize this or try to summarize this in one phrase, it seems that the hollowing out of the center of our income distribution, of the middle of our income distribution, leads to the hollowing out of the center of our political spectrum. So these trends are correlated. It is very hard to sustain a healthy, deliberative democracy when your middle class has been exposed to severe levels of stress, economic stress, and otherwise. And how is this operationalized? What are the ways in which this manifests itself politically? Well, first of all, it manifests itself through pessimism. So we know this through survey results and others. A growing sense of pessimism about one's own future, the future of the next generation. By the way, a sense of pessimism about the future is highly correlated with support for populist or extremist political movements and political parties. It is also correlated with anti-elite sentiment, which is the other side of this coin, the sense that economic, intellectual, political elites are illegitimate, they're ineffective, the system that they've built and the institutional architecture that they've built and populate is illegitimate. So it introduces a great degree of fragility into our institutions, and some of the events in January in Washington at the Capitol are a manifestation of this, but this is happening also across Europe. So we live in an anti-elite era, and we live in an era where institutional legitimacy is under question, and that is highly problematic. And it's also manifested through a growing anti-systemic sentiment and to some extent anti-democratic sentiment. And there's here again a lot of surveys and data that points to the fact that growing numbers of our citizens are beginning to question the legitimacy not just of our institutions, but of the overarching political system. So, growing support for authoritarian leaders, declining support for institutions that are there to serve as checks and balances to power, etc. This support seems to be growing within democratic societies around the world. Now, as an international relations person myself, this has a global dimension, because what this all constitutes, this that is occurring across advanced economies, democratic societies, can be described as the implosion of the international liberal order from within, because it is the countries that have built the international liberal order, the multilateral order, the global trading, global trade order, the European Union process. I mean, all of these fundamental pieces of the international architecture, it is those countries that are now sometimes being led by political parties and movements that seem to question that very order. So there's a real process of implosion and of growing illiberalism within the liberal world. This, of course, is not happening in a vacuum. There is also a change to the structure and distribution of power in the world, and the rise of illiberal powers is also a major factor. So we have this clash, this global collision of visions about the world, and a growing illiberalism around the world. And if you ask me, one of the major drivers of this process is the inequity, injustice of our systems within our countries, and a growing sense of detachment and systemic illegitimacy that is spreading within our countries. And some of these domestic political developments will do more damage to the system than any external threat that these systems might face. So some of the nationalist, nativist political movements in the US and in many European countries will do more damage to NATO, to the EU integration process, to the World Trade Organization and the global trading regime, to the notions of the notion of accepting immigrants and diverse societies than any external threats that these institutions have faced over the past few years. Now, let me move on to the second bit of my intervention. Why is this relevant for academic institutions, for how we think about our mission and the work we do? And I have a number of ways and suggestions as to how we should behave and the initiatives we should have as we move forward. First, I think that if we buy this diagnosis and we think that this is true, then we should focus a lot of our academic attention and research attention on this problem. I think many of us in the academic space and many of our institutions were truly surprised by the events, particularly in 2016 with Brexit, the victory of Donald Trump in the United States and others. We're very surprised by these underlying forces of fracture within our societies that had suddenly popped up and been absolutely determining factors of the results of these democratic processes. That in all honesty, very few people were expecting would end up the way they did. So we have an obligation to study this phenomena, to understand where social pain lies, what are the drivers of that, and also, if you ask me, to put forward solutions, to suggest through our applied research work and our engagement with governments and with multilateral institutions and with corporates from around the world, ways of addressing this. And to be quite frank, the fact that we were surprised in 2015, 16, 17 is to some extent a manifestation of our collective failure to look at these things head on. And by the way, I mean, there was some very compelling data already before these political events took place that pointed to a problem, and in the United States, for example, there are communities where the children now have shorter life expectancies than their parents, which we hadn't seen since the end of the Second World War. Again, in the US, if you follow the work that has been done by Angus Deaton and other economists on what they're calling the deaths of despair, these are deaths from substance abuse, alcoholism, suicide, and others. And you overlay, and you try to see what the overlap is between the increase in deaths of despair and the income stagnation over the last few years and growth of income inequality, the overlap is almost perfect. So clearly we had been seeing a lot of economic data, but also social pain metrics coming up over the past few years that point in the direction that we had a real issue. So number one, what should academic institutions do? Well, they should continue to fulfill their mission. Go out, understand how the world works, identify the challenges and the issues that are affecting our societies, and also put forward effective solutions for governments, corporations, and other stakeholders to implement. Number two, I think we need to make sure that access to our institutions continues to be equitable. Ideally, is fully needs blind. I think if academic institutions become part of the problem because they're too costly and they're difficult to access, not just because of financial cost, but because of what we value in the admissions process, which ends up producing a very tilted admissions process towards people that have attended private schools or that have had additional resources during their high school years, then academic institutions would not be fulfilling their mission. And we would be part of the problem of social ossification, of the reduction in social mobility, and we would be contributing to this notion that the system is rigged and that this is not a level playing field for everybody. There are very effective solutions to this, either through public education, which in Europe in most cases is either free or close to free. And we need to provide that type of education with resources for it to be competitive. If you're a private institution and you don't have the benefit of public funding, then we have to build a philanthropic architecture around our work and make sure that allows us to provide people with scholarships and financial aid schemes in a way that basically ends up producing a much more just, fair, and meritocratic access into our classrooms. By the way, this goes beyond higher education and university admissions. I think this should be occurring all the way throughout the pipeline of education, because by the time applicants get to universities, a lot of the social inequities have already been reflected or captured in their CVs and academic performance. So we need to make sure that equality of opportunity is happening all the way down to the 0 to 3 education period, which, by the way, we now know is absolutely fundamental for the cognitive and physical, even brain development of individuals. So we need to make sure that there is either public options and free options for people at that age, or that we have financial aid structures that allow for people to access opportunities all the way up until the end of their university studies. The third element, on top of our research and equitable access and financial aid, I think is through student experience. So once our students come here, it's not just that they've had access to financial aid and others, but it's also about them being exposed to the realities of the world through their activities while on campus, but also through activities abroad, doing field work, being exposed to social challenges. We're very firm believers here at IE about problem-driven education, challenge-driven education, that students leave here with a sense of purpose and a sense of collective challenges that need to be addressed. One way of putting this is a sense of public service. To a large extent, people that come through our classrooms are privileged people. They're people that have had the fortune of advice, of support throughout their lives. So they should be willing to give back, and that is done through identifying challenges and trying to address them. Fourth, and I think this is very important, academic institutions can be real conveners of an ecosystem of stakeholders to address these challenges. So it's not just our faculty, it's not just our students, but we can bring corporates into the classroom, we can bring multilateral institutions into the classrooms, we can bring governments into our classrooms and into our rooms and into our meeting spaces to discuss these issues, so we can be real catalysts for change. But let me end on this, and I know I'm running out of time. We have a huge responsibility as academic institutions to address the equity, justice, inclusion challenge. If we fail at this, if we do not contribute through these 4 areas of action that I've outlined, and probably others that I have omitted or left out, we will be failing our mission as academic institutions to shine light on problems, to train people to address the challenges of their generation and of the next years, and to convene society to these conversations and address these challenges head on. So I couldn't be more convinced that this is a central topic and a central challenge for academic institutions. And from our part of the world and from this institution, we couldn't be more convinced that this is part of our mission as a higher education institution. So thank you very much again for the invitation, and I hope the rest of the conference and the panels go very well.